Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Just imagine that you just happen to know somebody who's suffering from a mental illness. Sure, maybe they have a difficult time functioning in society, doing the normal things that most of us, would quite frankly deem normal. But what if there was a little bit more when we decided to go ahead and turn the mirror and see the perhaps miracle that's standing before us? Well, there were certain people throughout history that we considered the same way, especially when these particular people were actually followed by those known or who were close to them. For instance, St. Francis of Assisi. What's known about a prince who actually leaves his palace and family and early on lives a life of extreme asceticism in a forest? These were major mystics that pointed us to more sane ways of living together. How would we handle them today? In fact, last year, USA Today published a series of articles called The Cost of Not Caring. One particular article was subtitled The Financial and Human Cost of Neglecting the Mentally Ill. What does this neglect say about our collective spiritual health, and what effect might it have if we changed our perspective about who mystics really are? The mentally ill and trauma victims, especially if we see what they and we all have in common. On the program today, we're joined by someone who has more than 30 years of consciously trying to become an instrument of the compassion that have experienced and done this through offering deep listening in professional and voluntary roles as a chaplain, spiritual director, social activist, contemplative practitioner, meditation instructor, and through the completion of a master's program in contemplative psychotherapy, has served in hospitals, nursing homes, addiction treatment centers, prisons, community mental health centers, and on the streets. Wow, that's quite a resume. So we're going to be talking today about mysticism, mental illness, and complex trauma. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Mr. Mark Lesinowski. Mark, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity.
Now, let's talk about this for a little bit. It's interesting when you talk about blending mysticism, and the idea of perhaps saintlyhood when it comes to viewing mental illness, for instance. Tell us how you brought all this together.
Well, some of it came from my own story, and I'll take just a moment to kind of make a long story short here. About 35 years ago, I was in my mid-20s, which is a time where a lot of people have what is commonly referred to as their first break in terms of mental breakdown. And what I've learned since is that can also be looked at as a breakthrough. Anyway, I was living self-destructively, as many young men at that age may be, and came to a point where I could no longer go on that way, and had what a psychotherapist later termed as a passive suicide attempt. Now that was hitting my bottom, and I hit it hard and really crashed, and at 3 a.m, I had what might be termed a nervous breakdown in front of a police officer and my family. Fortunately, I was in the midst of a very understanding and compassionate group of people there, and not everybody has that when they hit their bottom. So the next day, less than 24 hours later, I went to church for the first time in a while, and at that Mass, I heard, in my interpretation at the time, the voice of Jesus saying, "You are the light of the world." Hence the name of my spiritual direction practice. And it just blew me away. I was in ecstasy, and here I was within 24 hours gone from the deepest depths of pain to a height of exaltation that I had never known before. Fast forward a year later, after a year of really isolating. So first of all, take, a possibly what might be termed a suicide attempt. I heard a voice of Jesus, and I wound up in isolating myself a lot afterwards in the darkness, just being with this and wondering what to do. Had somebody interviewed me from a mental clinic, I was on a crisis hotline team for a while, had somebody from that kind of position had interviewed me and heard, let's see here, suicide attempts, isolating, which is one of the biggest symptoms of mental illness, and hearing voices. I could, if I wasn't in the midst of caring family at that time, I could have been sent into an emergency department and given psychiatric medications, could have been sent up to a mental ward and around people who are entrenched, become entrenched in that culture and that way of thinking about themselves. I could have picked up on that. Fast forward a year later, I have a near-death and out-of-body experience. As soon as I came out of that experience, and within that experience, I had a sense of, like Jacob in the Old Testament, wrestling with God, and I came out of that, and for the next 3 years, I saw bright light in everything and everybody. Again, the light of the world. I realized that the statement, "You are the light of the world," could not have just been for me, but must mean everybody and everything at that point, including those that we put on the margins. And so there's something special when Jesus says, "Whatever you do to the least of my brothers and sisters," he's including those that are usually excluded by us and pushed out to the margins, pushed out of sight. Get away from me, you make me uncomfortable, you're in the way of my pursuit of the American dream, whatever it may be. There's something special about including the excluded. And we know that on an interpersonal level, too. When I include those things that I would rather put in the shadows, that I don't like about myself, that I'm not comfortable with, when I can do that lovingly, how healing that is. And that's what I'm hoping for, and I'm hoping to gather the compassion and wisdom power of your listeners to rally around the least of our brothers and sisters.
Now let's talk about what mysticism, as you use that term, really means.
Okay, yeah, and that really is a good question. There's a number of different if you want to call them definitions out there, then you can see that and use that. I kind of keep it simple because then it starts getting complicated. For me, it starts with somebody who has a mystical experience, and what that may be, I'll define the mystical experience first. It's when our usual ego sense of separation dissolves and a sense of union pervades, that sense of oneness with everything. And this can happen in a number of ways. It can be really dramatic, or it can be slow and subtle. It can be awe-inspiring. It can be peace-inducing. But anyway, I believe that it usually probably starts with some sort of mystical experience. And then mysticism to me then becomes what I would say the art and the science of adjusting one's life to this way of seeing things. Like William Blake said, if the doors of perception were cleansed, we would see everything as it is, infinite. And I believe also then we would see what Jesus saw when he said, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me." We can all make that claim. Every mystic, every human being can make that claim that whatever anybody does to anyone or any sentient being, it affects all of us. It affects myself. And so that's some of what I would say. Also, I would say that it helps to have guides when something like this happens. And I'd like to dispel the notion, maybe it can happen, but mystical experience don't necessarily immediately cleanse us of our neuroses, psychoses, personality disorders. And they meet people at whatever stage of spiritual development they may be at. So a fundamentalist can have a mystical experience, and they're going to interpret that and live that through their fundamentalist ways. And the highest of contemplative mystics are also going to be met in that way. So it can be many things.
Mm-hmm. Now, mental illness is one of those things that society deems a person who doesn't really seem to fit well within the scheme of what we would call normal everyday living. And I think that when back in the 1980s the movie Rain Man came out, people perhaps maybe had a different view, albeit a small one in most cases, because after the fact, sure, we were intrigued by what seemed to be otherworldly abilities of someone, for instance, the role played by Dustin Hoffman, of someone who was able to access information. For instance, the ability to solve complex math problems just by basically spitting it out. For instance, what is the square root of some 7-digit number?
Right.
And there was an instance where I had actually, there was a book I was reading by Deepak Chopra, I believe it was called Unconditional Love or Unconditional Life or something like that. And he was talking about twin brothers who he said eerily looked a lot like Tweedledee and Tweedledum, who basically were sitting in the corner all day long just spewing these complex mathematical problems. And, the question being, how do they access this information? Where is it coming from? Of what dimension are we so-called normal beings living in when this is occurring right here in front of us? Yet we decide, well, they're mentally ill, they should be heavily medicated, supervised, they certainly can't fit in society, and you kind of scratch your head and wonder, are we doing a disservice to these particular kind of people just because they can't sit in a classroom or conduct themselves in a normal job or even a social setting? What injustice, perhaps, as you seem to be describing, are we really inflicting on these people when we could perhaps be accessing things that it's time for us to learn and evolve with?
Boy, that's great, Dan. Thank you for that observation. And I'd like to start off in responding to that by reading John Nelson, a psychiatrist. He wrote a book called Healing the Split, Integrating Spirit into Our Understanding of Mental Illness. Here's his definition of psychosis. He says, psychosis is any one of several altered states of consciousness, transient or persistent, that prevent integration of sensory or extrasensory data into reality models accepted by the broad consensus of society and that lead to maladaptive behavior and social sanctions. Now, that's a huge definition of what psychosis may be. It's very broad. And like you were saying, how do we separate what's psychosis from mysticism, what's wisdom from what's craziness? It can be difficult to hash out, but I really do think that we need to expand our definition of what we mean by normal and adaptive behavior. Now, there's a concept called transliminality that implies that some people who have a higher level of transliminality, they're more open, more sensitive to input, not only from the physical world, sensory type. Like for myself, I walk into a department store and I just freak out. There's so much sensory input there. But not only a physical, but also more sensitive and open to metaphysical input. And that's going to come out and show up in a way that isn't what we typically see in the world around us. And trying to explain that can be difficult. And so, we have the great mystic teachers who teach some esoteric teachings that are typically ignored by people who, or people may be frightened by those teachings and tend to go more with a doctrinal legalism kind of stuff. It's just so hard for some people to take in. And there's actually some studies that show that a majority of psychologists are very low in terms of transliminality. They don't access the metaphysical realities. I'm using the word reality. Some would argue with that, but they don't have as much access to it. And for somebody who does, that can be frightening to other people who don't. And God only knows what we're missing out on when we ignore and lock up and over-medicate folks like this.
Well, the other key, too, is, who has decided what is deemed to be normal behavior.
Right. Exactly. And I think people, this is where we could really stand to listen to family members and other support people, other professionals who have listened to and watched the behavior of their loved ones who may have been diagnosed with a particular type of mental illness. And there's a statement from contemplative psychotherapy that is islands of clarity, where sometimes you just hear or see these islands of clarity. And even if the volume of the interpretation may be turned up a little bit, and it sounds psychotic to us, there's still something worth listening to there. I think about all the reports and all the clients that I've had that talk about somebody trying to control their thoughts and somebody trying to control their brain, and it may be the government or aliens or something else, or there's a chip in my brain, something like that. And then I go around, walking around town here, and everybody has something plugged into their ears. And, we're all being influenced. And, in fact, I'm trying to influence people through this radio show. We are being influenced by external stuff. And we do need to be more discriminating about what it is that we let in and let out. And so there's a brilliant message there coming from these people that if we only have the ears to hear, we can pick up on some incredible wisdom that we may be throwing away.
It's really interesting as you talk about, for instance, people receiving messages and, of course, sometimes the way they act out on that. And what came to mind for me immediately was, and I don't know why, but David Berkowitz. In 1977, he was known as the Son of Sam, who notoriously was going around and randomly shooting people in New York City during the summer or August months, I believe it was. And this was someone, as he was finally captured, had claimed that he was receiving orders to kill from a dog. Now, when you take a look at something like that, that seems a little far-fetched to believe. Was it possible this was a mystical being who was just severely misunderstood?
Yeah, and this is where I'm not a real radical on this, and there's some people more radical with this than I am. There are times I mentioned the phrase before, turned up the volume in one particular direction. There are times where certainly you hear the psychosis, and this is where it's important that we do have safe places for people like this, and that we do have medication that can help turn down that kind of volume, and maybe even within something that out of the range of what we can deem as acceptable in our society. As we turn that down, maybe there's something there. Maybe he too had something to tell us worth listening to that we couldn't hear at that particular volume, and that was at a volume that was truly dangerous. So yeah, I'm not a radical on this.
Well, we certainly weren't trying to be that, but I'm certain out there that as people hear this, they'll be thinking, okay, well, aren't we kind of being extreme in the direction? Should we consider these people that we deem crazy to be potential mystics that we really need to be paying attention to?
Exactly. Yeah, I hear you. Mm-hmm.
Now, you've really got quite an extensive background, and I have to ask, after serving in hospitals, nursing homes, addiction treatment centers, prisons, community mental health centers, and even people on the streets, Are there some consistencies with people in your experience, where there might be clues that we might want to take a little closer look into the idea of crazy?
Boy, that's a good question, Dan. As I think about that,
Because I could certainly say this, Mark, if I was to span the media globe, if you will, I could certainly point out some consistencies where I would deem broadcasters just plain nuts. Yet we listen to these people with so-called integrity buying into everything they have to say, and I think to myself, why are people buying this?
Right. Yeah, I hear you. Well, one thing I would say for beginners, or from the start, first part of my response would be, I think we all have the seeds of mysticism in us, and intuition goes along with that, and developing our intuition. And over time, and I'm sure other people who have done the work that I do, and even, just anybody walking down the street, you know that you get an intuitive sense when something just isn't right. And I think that can be done, too, with listening to radio broadcasters. So far, Dan, you sound great, and I have a good feel for you. But, if I had an intuitive hit, that this program or this speaker or this person walking towards me down the street, there's something wrong. I've got to trust my intuition with that. So I don't know that's something that can really be put into the books as some solid scientific evidence there. And then on the other end of the meeting, I would say it's important to judge a tree by its fruits. There's David Berkowitz and his experience, and the fruits are destructive. You take a look at Jesus, the Buddha, Francis of Assisi, other mystics, and if I may speak so boldly about myself, I had those strange experiences, and yet the fruit that has come out of that has been largely positive, and certainly it's been positive from those other mystics that I talk about. So I would say trusting the intuition and judging a tree by its fruits.
Mm-hmm. Now, earlier I used the term complex trauma. Describe what that is.
Okay, and I'm just learning about this some myself, and so are many mental health professionals. I can speak about it in probably more in terms of with the trauma that we've come to see, the post-traumatic stress disorder. I prefer to call it post-traumatic stress response. I don't see it as a disorder or an illness. It's a response to a crazy situation. War is crazy, and so complex trauma, as opposed to what we've come to know as PTSD, is it refers to more childhood trauma and something that's been ongoing. When we talk about PTSD, it's usually war veterans. They're adults or late in their teen years. It could be from an accident, car accident, or something like that. But with complex trauma, it could be something that happens even before birth. It can be something that happens within the womb. It can be childhood sexual abuse, and just a whole bunch of traumas that have happened before the brain develops into the adult brain that we know, so that with trauma after trauma after trauma, physical abuse in the house, all this stuff, and it's happening over and over again, that is building these neural pathways in the brain. And when we think about pathways, if something goes over the same pathway, of violence is the thing that goes over the same pathway over and over and over and over again, it's going to create a rut. And so we wonder why some people are stuck in ruts of getting into traumatic situations and abuse situations, neglect situations, whatever it may be. It's because early on a rut was created in their neural pathways, and it's difficult to get out of there. So that would be one of the big differences. Again, like with mental illness, okay, so a mystic has that where the veil is parted, the doors of perception, like, again, back to William Blake, the doors of perception get cleansed. Well, that can be done. Those doors can just be busted down in trauma. They're busted, broken away over and over and over again. So the veil doesn't just part, it's torn asunder and ripped. With mental illnesses, that veil, that door, again, is taken away in some subtle ways, some other different ways. But here's where the three really connect, is what happens to those doors of perception to open us up to more metaphysical phenomena.
Mm-hmm. You know, I can't help, for some reason, as you were describing all of this, is the character Superman. And, you know, here's a story about a baby that came to Earth from another planet. Fortunately ends up, you know, with a couple in Middletown, Heartland, USA, of all places.
Yeah.
You know, has these marvelous powers that it doesn't even know yet. Yet this loving couple takes this baby in as their own and, of course, nurtures it the right way. But you kind of have to wonder, what if that baby crashed somewhere else and got involved in complex trauma and had the ability to grow into an adult as Superman did? What then would Superman be like?
Right. Well, yeah,
kind of a crazy
exactly.
notion, but why not?
Yeah, why not? And this, you know, goes back to my story. What would have happened if I wasn't in the midst of a loving family and a loving community when at 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, I have a nervous breakdown and the cops come to the door? I would have been sent probably to a mental hospital or a jail, both maybe. Anyway, yeah, you know, I think about people like Bill in the Kill Bill movie. You know, certainly a mystic, but a destructive man. You know, again, it doesn't get rid of the personality disorders that may happen, the narcissist, the antisocial people. Mystical experiences, you know, can happen to anyone in any place and in any stage of development, and you know, with their histories involved of violence or whatever. So, oh God, this goes back to the original part of the plea, to make loving and caring and including communities for helping people with mental illness and complex trauma, so that we can all benefit from the gifts that may come from somebody with these higher levels of sensitivity and transliminality.
Mm-hmm. You know, finding this is also fascinating, especially as we talk about mental illness, complex trauma, and mysticism. And I'm reminded of the late philosopher Alan Watts, as I read in one of his books, as he was talking about how we go to treat mental illness in the world today. We tend to use psychotherapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, who all, of course, consider their disciplines to be scientific, or at least science-based. And yet you see a system that seems to be growing in and of itself exponentially. As you were talking about earlier, you see people who have breakdowns who end up either in prison or they end up in mental hospitals. It's usually one of those things. Let's just cage these people up. Going back to Alan Watts, he had made this interesting suggestion, and taking a look at the scope of a person's behavior from the view of someone who is an anthropologist. And perhaps this person is misplaced in a cultural setting, and to be able to study and understand this person's behavior to a degree of deciding what particular culture and area would this person really fit and thrive most likely in. And as I read that, I thought, that makes a heck of a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, years ago I was watching a National Geographic special where a family from the United States would actually go to a place and they would live as those people lived. One family, for instance, goes to Africa. This is a nice, somewhat middle-class family of some affluence. They end up in this small village in Africa where there's no real running water. Their bathrooms, of course, are somewhere behind a broken wall somewhere, no flushing toilets. And as even the guy says, these people really don't live so well. But what is it about them that makes them so happy even under these conditions? There was another one where they went to this place, and I'll never forget this one. It was considered the Island of Love, okay?
Oh, wow.
And this was a place where basically it seemed the men sat around all day and did next to nothing. And I think there would be a lot of American male couch potatoes that would think, that's pretty ideal, as the women went around and did all the work. When it came to really collecting, food for the village, only the men went out fishing. That sort of thing. But the point is you're talking about cultural societies here that are much different from the particular cultures these families lived in. And they went to live amongst these people. And it was funny, especially on the Island of Love situation, where there was a husband and wife. He was an engineer. He was fairly passive, and she seemed to be the alpha male of the family. And there was a point, they were showing, for instance, how they lived, where she was micromanaging, it seemed, every single day of their week. That she was deciding what was going on in the family and so forth. And now, here these two are on this island where this guy gets to kind of sit around and hang out with the men, and he doesn't have to worry about it. She's got to go and do the work with all the women. And she was, at one point, you see her kind of frustrated. Don't you think you're going to get too used to this sort of a thing? But that in juxtaposition, for instance, of this mental illness that we like to deem, is to really think, would that anthropologist ideal perhaps hold water in a situation like this?
Oh, I think that's wonderful, and there are attempts here to kind of find a middle ground there. The Wind Horse model out of Boulder, Colorado, and people from Naropa University, where professionals go into the home of the client, of the person who's experienced a mental disturbance, and work with them and work with the family rather than taking them out of the family home. And so they do learn to do things in a loving, supportive environment that are, go along with our society, cooking, cleaning, that kind of stuff. And then also their particular way of being is honored and looked after, and they're seen as valuable human beings. There were models out in the San Francisco Bay Area. I can't remember the names of the houses out there where they did something similar. And of course, with what you're saying, we can see the opposite effect for when somebody, like if I were to go into, if I had been sent to a psychiatric ward, there starts an enculturation too. And so we would see in community mental health plenty of people who had become enculturated and didn't trust or didn't want to do anything other than the medications and the typical American quick fixes to what was going on for them, and they took on the expected characteristics and behaviors, or what has become expected for this particular population. And so, yeah, the opposite of that is certainly seen. So why not, stretch how we see normal and do things, and try and maximize. Like a good coach in a sport would see, okay, this person, they have these gifts, but not those. Let's see what we can do with that to make a stronger team here. So I love what you're saying there, Dan.
And I think it's fascinating, and what also comes to mind for me is my mind seems to work that way, in these strange, intangible golden threads of spinning together what seem to be random things that all of a sudden come together. Oh, that makes a lot of sense, but we all, for those of us who remember the Ken Louise Fletcher novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and here's this guy that basically thinks, played by Jack Nicholson, no, I don't really want to go to prison, so I'm going to kind of try to convince these people that I'm nuts, okay? Which was Randall Patrick McMurphy was the character that Jack Nicholson played.
Right.
But here he goes into this mental facility, and basically he's getting all of these people who were allegedly volunteer patients there. In other words, he discovers, you mean to tell me you can walk out of here anytime you want? Yeah, pretty much. So you have all these doctors, that are doing the things they're doing with these patients, who seem to almost be non-interactive and in some cases catatonic, and they all start seemingly become alive and have some sort of a thirst and passion for life again. And it's all because of this, Randall Patrick McMurphy, who really most of us view as the one who's sane, but he's trying to work the system in a way that he thinks is better than going to prison.
Right, yeah.
It's pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, definitely. He would be the agent provocateur there, lighting the fire under people and provoking them into a bigger, richer life. And boy, what a metaphor that is for a lot of our lives. I know for myself too, is I want to find a place that feels safe. And maybe it's not a safe place for somebody else, but it feels safe to me. And, I start to become comfortable then. And then it takes somebody or something to really push me and prod me till I'm so uncomfortable in what I used to think was comfort that it pushes me to grow spiritually and mentally and in all ways. And, you got me thinking about, Joseph Campbell arguing that, so many people say what people are looking for is meaning. And Joseph Campbell was saying, well, I think what people are really looking for is the experience of being alive. And it seems to me that that's what McMurphy was doing. He was, hey, you guys aren't dead. You're alive. Come on, let's have an experience of being alive. And while that might be frightening at first, and at first it might be frightening for us to think about incorporating more of the folks experiencing mental illness, or whatever it may be they're experiencing. Mystics, we've killed mystics for centuries also, and sent them out to the edges of town and not wanted to listen to their messages and that. What would happen? It can be frightening to consider including one of these people that when I walk down the street, I don't want to make eye contact with them, that kind of thing. So, yeah, it can be frightening, but we can do it. We can do it.
Mm-hmm. Now, we can also go to the other extreme as you consider that one Jim Jones, had become this person who was receiving that particular message where he had created what was known as the People's Temple agricultural project, which, happened in South America, and here's some 900 people died as a result of suicide. Now, that's pretty tragic.
Yes, it is.
Yet there was a moment in his motivation and how these people, we're talking about people that were coming from families that were, or individuals, they were pretty much considered sane and worked well in society. These weren't people who were nuts. These were people who were affluent, that were able to actually begin to follow this guy and support him, and that this guy was a charismatic leader to such a degree that in the beginning of this, this, I guess, call it pilgrimage to what was known as the People's Temple, really in the beginning they were like, this is really paradise. And then something changed.
Yeah.
And you have to wonder, okay, if we're talking about mystics, how do we relate to someone like that as being someone who could be considered mystic and someone worthy of following to the point that you're willing to die, to commit suicide in this massive undertaking? It's pretty incredible where that veil, that thin line really is.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where it's important for spiritual directors, psychotherapists, ministers, and most people. It would be great if we all had some sense of the stages of spiritual development, where there's plenty of research now that's been done that shows that there's these stages, and they're pretty much all in agreement. And one that's kind of easy to follow is you remember M. Scott Peck from The Road Less Traveled and A Different Drum?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. In A Different Drum, he plots out 4 stages. And in the first stage of spiritual development, he calls it the chaotic and antisocial stage. And some of what happens there, some of the characteristics, these are people before they get involved in like the mainline religions or mainstream religions and churches and stuff like that. They can pretend to be loving and pious, but they're so egocentric. Growth goes from egocentric to ethnocentric to global to
sort of
cosmic.
like Jimmy Falwell, right?
Well, exactly, and Jerry Falwell.
I lived in Virginia while that guy existed.
Okay.
I'm thinking to myself, okay, you people are really buying this.
Yeah,
I
hear you. That's okay. And he's an example of a stage 2, the institutional or fundamental. And so what a stage 1 person will do, being egocentric, they may have the mystical experience there, but they're going to use that experience, that mystical experience, to continue to build up their ego.
Right.
It can look pious and loving, but it's all about ego. They really don't care about anybody else. And then that second stage, it's more ethnocentric. It's about, you've got to be a part of this ethnocentric group, or else you don't have it. Your way is the wrong way because it's not our way. You're not following our way of doing it. So it goes in those stages. Then also, at one time in my career, I had been working in a Skid Row area of another city, and with the poor and mentally ill and addicts and alcoholics there. And I was thinking about going into another city in the same state and working in an area that was affluent. And as I was interviewing for the job, the person who was interviewing me said, you may not be aware of it, but you see all these big houses around here. People have bought more than what they can handle right now, and there's many suicides, many suicidal people in these incredible, affluent-looking places. So a lot of those people who were going to see Jim Jones were probably experiencing some of that emptiness that can happen in those neighborhoods, in those big homes. And this is where I would argue with Joseph Campbell a little bit. He's probably right to one degree, but I wouldn't rule out that people are looking for meaning in their lives. And, if they're not finding it, it doesn't matter how much they have, and maybe they should go to Africa for a while and live where there's no running water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just such a fascinating subject to talk about, all of this, because in relation to the human condition, we have to ask ourselves, what is normal? And if we have been able to define that as we have seemingly done, at least in our society here in America, then, what meaning does it really bring us to be normal, to fit in, when there's so much more? I mean, how many of us, for instance, here's a trauma, a complex trauma you might consider that we haven't even explored yet, and that is of our education system. How often, and I know because I was one of these people too who, at times I've even shared this on the radio as a young child. I remember in 3rd and 4th grade, especially the 4th grade, simply being sent to the office, wondering why I was being sent there, went to the nurse's station. They said, "You're going to go ahead and lie down in this bed here," and that's where I spent the rest of my school day. That's a tough bite for a 4th grade kid to be coming to school at 9:30 in the morning, being sent to the office, and being there until 3:30 in the afternoon.
Yeah.
I didn't want to go to school anymore without really understanding why I had to go and do this. Then the threat coming from the principal, if you get out of line again, back on that bed you go. What kid really wants to go to school? Now, on the other hand, we'll take it to a common level, and that is that of the parent-teacher conference. No. And there has been one particular thing that I've talked with over and over, especially as I talk with, motivational experts and leaders from around the world, as I have over many years. And I love bringing this up because it sometimes, I think, would help give our listeners a thought. That's right. I've been living with this trauma for a long time where my parent sat down with my teacher, and the teacher says this, Daniel's one heck of a student, bright, has a lot going, but just isn't living or working up to his potential.
Oh, God, yes.
Okay, now think about this. This coming from a teacher who probably hasn't lived up to their potential, making this particular statement.
Oh, God, I feel your pain there, Dan. I truly do. Yep, it's mine, too. Yeah, I hear you.
So there's a complex trauma, one that we all commonly have probably experienced.
Yeah, definitely. I know for myself, I'm kind of a round peg, and everything in school back in those days was a square, a square classroom, a square desk, a square teacher, and and I would, you're going to be forced to fit into this or else. And the thing that always got me was, as I look back and think about that is, certainly I said I do have a loving family and did have a loving family, but everything wasn't perfect in there, and there was never a question back then of what's going on in the system, what's going on at home, and then the expectation that a 4th grader live up to their potential is just plain. Talk about psychotic. I mean, that's just not realistic thinking at all. We've got to grow and grow and grow in that potential, and that could certainly include the feeling of not feeling very in tune with the educational system as it was. Fortunately, there's a lot more options these days for kids.
Well, there's certainly a lot of truth in that. In fact, you're seeing more of a turn of online education. And, outside of the fact that perhaps a lot of these young children might miss out on the social aspects, or at least be limited to the social aspects that a mainstream school provides, which is very important, social acclimation, I don't see any real trouble with children bypassing the classroom altogether as long as the online education is guided, because what you're seeing is now more of a trend, and to me I actually think it's a good one, is that these children are becoming motivated by what their interests are. And shouldn't we then be helping them to develop what those interests are? How many people really do we remember as we're sitting in grade school learning about history really cared about history? Most of us didn't, because we didn't see the correlation at that time between how is it relevant about what George Washington or Abraham Lincoln did compared to me who wants to get out there and play some baseball in a diamond right now. Why don't we talk about Babe Ruth, for instance?
Right.
Yet, as we became adults, we finally found history to become fascinating because we then began to connect the dots and realize, well, this is where we came from and why we sort of have done what we've done in order to understand and change that, perhaps. But it's really fascinating how all this seems to tie together.
Yeah, it really does. And as you're talking, I'm here. I'm an introvert, and who grew up in a very extroverted society, and the expectation, as you're talking about online schooling, the expectation in school that you have a lot of friends and all that, and somebody in online school, if they just have one good friend, I mean, the socialization is definitely important, but as an introvert, the push to be popular and to have a bunch of friends was painful to me too. It's like, no, what, can't I just go home and sit in a rocking chair in the dark and brood and think about things and ponder, my life and this stuff? No, you got to go out and you got to be involved in this and this and this and this and this. Fine for the extrovert, but not for the introvert.
I don't know why, but this gentleman comes to mind, and that's one Robert Crumb. Now, most people might remember Robert Crumb of the underground 60s illustrators, that came up with terms such as keep on trucking and created Fritz the Cat, for instance. Yeah. And there's a wonderful first-person documentary about him, and it's simply titled Crumb. And there was a scene in there where he was sketching this, what was known as this bully that he had known. Basically, it was loosely based on someone he knew, a character he created by the name of Scutch. And here's Scutch, he was kind of strong, he was very charismatic, that kind of bully that we typically see in school that sets the rules for everybody. And here he is beating up on my brother, kind of a thing. And so that was coming to mind when you talk about the extrovert versus the introvert. As you said, why can't I just sit in my room in the dark in a rocking chair and perhaps draw or whatever the case is? Now, let's take a look at Robert Crumb. Okay, so eventually, he created this cult following. A lot, see, as you said, you finally came to know who he was. Well, just a few years back, he began, or there was a selling of a book where he actually recreated the biblical book of Genesis.
Oh, my goodness.
And then we're talking about completely, as only Robert Crumb could do, literally drawing the book of Genesis, the full story as it was in the Bible. And you're going to call this guy nuts? Yeah. I mean, how many people would really read the Bible? But if you're a Robert Crumb fan and you see his drawings, you think, that would be interesting to see the book of Genesis as the way that he would do it.
Oh boy, that's wonderful, Dan. I'm going to have to go read it. One of my sons is a part-time cartoonist in a way, and so he's the one who showed me Robert Crumb and all. So that's wonderful. And God, I'm just thinking now and connecting this back to complex PTSD or complex trauma. It's kind of the third one. They're talking about mystics and mental illness, and this complex trauma is really something that I think we need to pay attention to in these days, because we're finding out more and more that the impact of this, that many of us, including the mentally ill, including mystics, have been through trauma. In fact, with the great mystics, usually there's some sort of sacred wounding that's involved that helps to open up the door of perception, to cleanse that. Again, an agent provocateur or something like that. But one of the things that they're finding effective for treating complex trauma right now, first of all, they're finding that it can create, when psychic woundings go on over and over and over again, it can create actual physical woundings in the heart and in the brain. So neurologists and cardiologists are finding this, and so they've been using hyperbaric chamber treatment to treat like veterans, and now they're using it for people with complex trauma to help actually physically heal those physical wounds from the psychic traumas. And so I can imagine it's kind of a Genesis type experience where you go into the dark chamber like a womb, like a beginning in darkness, and you receive I think it's like 90% oxygen with an oxygen mask. So the breath of life is being breathed into you, like God in the Genesis story with Adam and Eve, with the clay of the earth. So at the darkness of this beginning, it also is like the tomb on Holy Saturday after the death, in between the death of Jesus and his resurrection, the new life. It's the darkness of the tomb, of the cave. And so I think these hyperbaric treatments really can be helpful. And I'll expand on that and say allowing people, again, I mentioned that isolation is considered like the number one symptom of mental illness. Isolation and solitude, healthy, beautiful, wonderful solitude, are just a turn of the screw away from each other. So instead of worrying about somebody who's a loner or isolated, we can also check in and see if there's an element of solitude in there and wanting that experience of being able to go into the dark and experience the breath of life and come out renewed so that they can give new life to our world. That may take time alone in the dark.
Well, certainly the hyperbaric chamber was used by Michael Jackson.
Well, yeah, there you go. Yeah, I don't know what it did for him. I didn't read any kind of reports of what he was claiming, but
we certainly see the outcome.
yeah, really.
He was the king of pop, and most people would consider him to be eccentric and that of solitude as well. But how can you deny the gift this person brought to the world? He was the light. There's no doubt about it.
Great point, Dan, and thank you for bringing that in. And yeah, what I would suggest, for people who go through something like that is to maybe see a spiritual director or their minister or whatever to help them to integrate that experience. And it doesn't have to be the hyperbaric chamber. It can just be seeing a spiritual director so that, okay, what's it like for you when you do sit alone in the dark? What's that bringing you to? How can you integrate that into the whole of your life? And, what messages are coming from that? So, to connect with somebody. We used to have communities to do that, like, Black Elk, the great Lakota medicine man. He had his great dream, and he brought the dream to the people so that they could help him, dance it and chant it and make the metaphysical physical so we can incarnate what comes to us from higher, deeper realms, however you want to phrase that.
Mm-hmm. It's such a fascinating subject, and you think of a day and an age where we have technology, noise, messages, advertising, and all of this just surround us, and you can just begin to see this next generation, the millennials, where you're beginning to see an increase, for instance, of autistic symptoms. I wouldn't say autism, but autistic symptoms where these youngsters are shutting down, they're closing out the world, and I say, I don't think it's so much that it's a disease, but I believe it's a genetic mutation that these young children are coming into this noisy world knowing how to shut it down. And, in fact, it was just yesterday my wife and I were talking about depression, and I said, what I think? A lot of these people, especially who live in cities that suffer from depression, move them out to the countryside, put them out in the woods.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think it would alleviate a lot of those things, hence back to the anthropologist ideal of how do we deal with and work with the mentally ill so that we can cultivate and they can begin to, share those special gifts they have in the world.
Oh, beautifully said, Dan. Yeah, thank you for bringing that in. With and two, we have people like Thomas More from Care of the Soul talking about depression as the soul's way of trying to bring somebody deeper into their experience of life and of love and what it means. And I'll go back to the mystical phrase of Jesus that we can all claim that, whatever you do to anyone or anything, you do to me and to the whole. And there's a lot of weight. That's a lot of weight to take on and feel. And as I consider that reality, I believe it's a reality. I experience that reality. It takes me down into the depths. And to have guides like Francis, like Jesus, like the Buddha, who went down, I mean, they going out into the desert 40 days and 40 nights, under the Bodhi tree, that kind of stuff. They were willing to go down into those depths. And if we have a society that everything's supposed to be like a Happy Jolly Mountain Dew commercial where everyone's hyped up and that,
on
that's
sugar,
the
no less.
Yeah, on sugar, no less. And wired for sound with all these chips that we plant in our own ears, getting influenced by noise, fast. We're going to crack. We're going to crack. And cracked, when we crack under pressure, when we crack under G-force of moving too fast, if we don't transform that, we will transfer it. We will pass it on. And so here comes more trauma. Here comes, and it just goes on and on. So if we can look at some of these things differently, if we can change our vision and perspective of what the people going through these situations are going through and what they may be experiencing, and open up our minds to other possibilities, if we can do that, God knows how much better things can be for all of us.
Sure. Well, Mark, first of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to be on the program and sharing this with the world. Is there a way that our listeners can contact or get in touch with you?
Yes. I have my phone number and email listed on your site. Okay. I'd probably prefer email.
Which is beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50 for our listeners.
Yep, and it's there, and I'm on portlandtherapist.com and portlandtherapist.org with the good people from Wise Counsel and Comfort. If they look at Multnomah Village, which is listed on there among other places here in the Portland area, my name is under there. And so my phone number and email address and that are all there.
Well, very good. Mark, thank you for this very enlightening and stimulating conversation for all of us to begin to look at all things such as complex trauma and mental illness and maybe see it from a different perspective and realize the special gifts that may be standing right there in front of us.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate the opportunity again, and just want to remind your listeners, and this is the blessing that I try and give as people come, as you are the light of the world, and let your light shine. We need you.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Mark.
Thanks, Dan.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can also discover more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. And we also can be followed at Facebook as well as Twitter at Beyond50Radio. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 Radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.